Hello, and welcome to this next lecture in our series on mythology. My name is Dr. Breach Burke, and today we're here to talk about the 12 Olympians, a very basic kind of a topic that most people in some form are familiar with. You're either familiar with the 12 Olympians because, they're certainly part of our culture. We definitely, you see them in TV shows, you see them in movies. There's been books written. If you had taken any kind of Greek mythology in grade school or in high school or in any level of education that you've taken, you'll have encountered these names at some point. And they will be familiar to you. However, a lot of times the way in which these particular deities have been represented in in popular culture, in the way that they're done in Disney movies and things like that. Sometimes it leaves you with a wrong impression of exactly what that deity is, or it leaves you with a kind of either sanitized way of looking at them, or one that's just, when you're taking literary license, you might take a character like that and make it into something else. So this class is going to be about, let's talk about the 12. Now, normally when I teach this, I break it into two presentations, a part 1 and 2. However, just for ease of teaching this, I'm actually going to take 2 separate lectures, and I'm going to show you both of them. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of the 12, and we're going to look at some of the significant stories connected to them that represent some of their characteristics. Now, there are tons and tons of stories that we find from all over the world and all over the place, but the ones that I think most significantly convey their attributes are the ones that I want to talk about. It's probably worth mentioning right at the beginning talk a little bit about the way the gods were understood in the ancient world, because when we tend to think of the term God in Western culture, we tend to think about, we think of the Christian God, for example, or the Jewish God, or the Muslim Allah. You think about a God that is this kind of overarching intelligence that is generally assumed to be, the 3 words that are used are omniscient, omnibeneficent, and omnipresent. And what those 3 words mean are that they omniscient, they're all knowing, they know everything. They're omnibeneficent, which means they're all good. And omnipresent means just basically that God is everywhere. So God's everywhere and in everything. Isn't that the old hymn? That tends to be regardless of whether we're religious or not. Okay, and unless you come from an Eastern tradition where your concept of God is different, people who grew up in European countries, in the Americas, maybe even in, I don't know, I'm going to say particularly in those areas, because that seems to be what has ended up, for better or for worse, defining Western culture. That tends to be the concept of God. Okay, and you see that in other nations too that have been colonized, that they may also adopt that way of thinking. So, what we want to talk about now is, I want to talk about the way that the ancients thought about the gods, and they did not think about them as, first of all, they were not any of those things. They were not all good. Omnipresent is sort of, not necessarily though. And, the idea of them being all-knowing, again, yeah, I would say not necessarily. The ancient gods, part of the reason that it's a little bit confusing, because on the one hand, they are entities in their own right. They represent, the word that we use in religious studies is numinous. And numinous isn't also a very highly misunderstood word. A lot of people think numinous has to do with, for example, the atheist Daniel Dennett. He'll talk about the numinous as the kind of feeling you get when you see a spectacular sunrise, for example. That's not numinous. That is what they call aesthetic, or that's what they call epiphanal. And what those 2 big, scary jargon words mean is they're either something that just invokes a emotional response to the beauty of the situation, or it fills you with a kind of awe at, wow, look at that. An epiphany goes a little bit beyond that, because something that is epiphanal has to do with something that has like an aha moment to it. It's like a moment of just like of clarity. Okay, that's an epiphany. The numinous experience, even if it incorporates something of either of those other two experiences, is something entirely different. Numinous experiences are ones where you absolutely, first of all, when you have the experience, you are absolutely, utterly convinced of the experience. The experience is not a delusion. This experience is not, oh, gee, I saw this and I mistook it for some other thing. It is something that affects you so intensely, it's almost like a trauma. Okay, it can be like a trauma, or it can be an awakening on such a level that people who have had that experience are the ones who will say, when they talk about God, they will say, people say to them, would you believe in God? They say, I don't need to believe, I know. Okay, that's what the numinous experience does. And the numinous experience can be absolutely freaking terrifying. Okay, a numinous experience, because it's left people, I mean, yeah, people are completely changed after a numinous experience. It's not a lightweight experience, and you are encountering something that you know is there and is vastly different from you and vastly more powerful than you. Okay, whatever that thing turns out to be. But this is how deities are encountered. And certainly the ancients, because they had not overly developed what we think of as rational faculties. Not saying that to say that they were totally irrational, but their way of encountering and experiencing and perceiving the world was very likely different from ours. I mean, some things are probably the same, but as consciousness changed, it wasn't, when we started getting into the Greek philosophy, and when we started getting into this idea of analyzing and thinking things through, once we start moving into this era, the more language develops, the more we have these kind of faculties that go beyond, and written language develops. You know, now it becomes more the logos, the word, you know, that becomes more of the arbiter of truth, rather than the other things, rather than what's spoken of in the mythos. Okay, logos becomes, you know, becomes the thing. And humans, this is the start of Greek humanism as well, because humanism has to do with, you know, it means, first of all, it means the gods are not responsible for everything. Human beings are responsible for their own actions. Humanism also tends to mean that you are, you know, it also tends to put human beings above everything else that you experience in the world. So, you know, and that's had its good and bad, like anything. It's neither good nor, humanism is neither good nor bad. It has its benefits and it has its detriments, okay, in terms of how it affects everything in the way that we think about things. But it also brings morality and ethics into religion. So when we talk about we're going to talk about the 12 Olympians, but then it will become, you know, looking at the behavior of the gods and analyzing it in sort of human moralistic terms. So for instance, if Zeus cheats on his wife, they say, well, that's a bad example for a king to set. You know, it becomes more about how the gods are supposed to behave like ethical humans, because the humans in some ways start to equate themselves with the gods. I wouldn't say Plato went that far, but there definitely becomes this sense of, you know, it's almost kind of it wouldn't go as far as to say a rebellion against the gods, but it becomes more about me and what I do and my responsibility and my conscious reasoning and my conscious choices, rather than what the gods do. Now, the plus side of this is that then it's sort of like, yes, this is where we have personal responsibility. Your actions have consequences. You can't just go blame it on some external force. Okay, which is also at the same time as psychology, you know, psychoanalysis tells us is also an internal force. It's really both. Okay, it's experience. It has to do with what's going on and how we experience it and how it translates what's going on inside ourselves. Okay, so these are all the different components. But the ancient gods were forces. I don't think they were seen of, even though there's statuary of them that portrays them in human form. I would not go as far as to say that they believed that the gods were human. They believed they could appear as human, but they could appear as other things too. You see it in the stories where, you know, they do, and they say the way that a certain person appears, they say, I know that's not a human, that's a god. There's a difference. and the gods have control, and the gods are capricious is the word. They're unpredictable. You can't, a lot of times there's a talk of like, I'm going to sit down at night and I'm going to get on my knees and say, dear God, I would like blah, blah, blah. And there's sort of the expectation that if God is good, God's going to give you the thing that you've prayed for. And then when you don't, you go, oh, it's like, and that was never the expectation of the ancients. The ancients did not expect, they could make sacrifices and offerings, but they recognize that they may like the other guy in the other town. They may like their offering better, and they may get the thing that you wanted. You see this a lot in the Iliad, where there's different offerings being made to Zeus and to Athena and to the different gods. But the gods have already made up their mind whose side they're on, and their reasons for being on those sides, often pertain to things that the humans involved have no idea. They don't know what's going on, particularly the contract between Zeus and Thetis, which makes Zeus say, okay, I'm not going to support the Greeks until they apologize to Achilles and recognize and bring him back. But he also gets Achilles and says, no, Achilles' favorite companion, Patroclus, has to die first. So you see that in the Iliad. These are all the conditions that the gods are meeting. So they can sit there and make all the sacrifices they want, but the gods have already made up their mind how this is going to go. And there may be other gods fighting against them. Hera and Zeus are constantly at each other, but ultimately they're capricious. They may have different agendas. And also there's not this idea of devotion. We talk about devotion to the gods, like the idea that you might have somebody who's a priest or priestess of a god. That's probably the closest you're going to get to devotion, because that person has taken some kind of a special oath or vow. But for the average person, there's not this idea of, this god or goddess is my special favorite, and that god or goddess will favor you. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about that in some of these stories. Okay. So there's not this personal relationship with God. Personal relationships or direct experiences of God are covered by the term theos. Okay. And theos is like, well, we have the term theology, theological, comes from theos. And we think of that as a word for God, but it's really about the direct experience of God. And initially it refers to Dionysus worship. Dionysus, the god of wine, because by drinking wine, you can directly experience the god. And Dionysus is the first deity with which one could potentially have a quote unquote personal relationship. And that we will discuss in another lecture, but that's the interesting. And Dionysus, by the way, if you haven't, I have 2 podcasts on Dionysus on Chthoniya, but we talk about how he is actually the prototype for Jesus. Okay. The Jesus myth comes very largely out of the Dionysus myth. And that may surprise some of you, because you may think, well, how does a god of wine and orgies have anything to do with Jesus? Quite a lot, actually. And, that's, which again, may surprise some people. And if people here are particularly religious Christians, it's not something anybody should take offense at. It's just, those are the facts, because Dionysus was revered in a way that many others were not, and was seen as a savior figure. So, so we have these different elements. So it's the first and most important thing to understand before we start talking about the individual Olympian gods is that they are not, first of all, they're not just carbon copies of humans, and you cannot think about or evaluate the ancient gods in the same way you would think about what we call God today. It's a different concept. They're forces, and you appeal to those forces depending on what it is that you need. Oh, I need my crops to grow. Oh, I want to put a curse on that guy. I want that person to fall in love with me. I mean, there's a magical element that's contained within this as well. And you appeal to different deities depending on what you needed, and of course, then once you had city-states and things, there were gods that protected the whole nation state or the city state. And so therefore you would naturally have regular festivals, and, they had a huge calendar of festivals, huge. So, because all of these different forces, were appealed to or appeased at different times. Okay. And then obviously if there was a special crisis, there would be a special kind of thing that went on. So, and also there was an importance of oracles and omens. This was the way that you read nature and understood what it is the gods wanted from you, whether they were pleased, whether they were displeased. This was how you made that determination. And people still believe in oracles to this day. Okay, it's not, that's not a concept that's entirely gone away. We tend to think of science as replacing that. And yes, a lot of the mechanistic things that we talk about, and we also, science is good at predicting. It's good at telling us those things. However, by the same time, science is also based very much on the idea of causality, cause and effect. That, if A happen, if we have conditions A, then B will be the result. And that is not, as David Hume, the rationalist philosopher, had proven. He says that's not always true. Hume's theorem on causality is very interesting. I don't want to sidetrack into that here, but nonetheless, you can't assume automatically that just because I get up and normally most of the time this happens, that doesn't mean that's always going to happen. And this is something I think the Greeks were much more keenly aware of in their environment. Okay, so let's get into these presentations. Going into my share mode here. Let's see. Okay, and we want to play. Okay, so the first thing we have here is I have this, and the term that we use for the 12 Olympians is the dodecatheon, which is literally, this group of 12. Okay, dodeca is the Greek word for the number 12, and we'll see that the number 12 is important as well. So some of the major deities, and this is another chart I lifted from Mark Morford, his classical mythology textbook. Okay, so we have Cronus and Rhea. We talked about them. We talked about the original Titans who had given birth. And you see their children are Hestia, Hades, Poseidon, Demeter, Hera, and Zeus. And now we see underneath this, so those are the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, you have 6, okay, 6 out of the 12. The other ones, okay, and by the way, not everybody in this genealogy chart is considered to be an Olympian, okay, because there can only be 12. Then the others are, okay, so Zeus and Metis, okay, I had mentioned this in the Titanomachy lecture that Zeus swallows Metis, the goddess of wisdom, the Titaness of wisdom, after who he has impregnated after a prophecy that his child will be greater than him. However, Athena ends up popping out of Zeus's forehead, and so we'll talk about that. So Athena is another of the 12. Zeus and Maya, they produce the god Hermes. Okay, some people say Hermes. I mean, that's also common in this culture. The way I was taught in grad school is Hermes. So I don't know. Probably either is technically correct in modern speech. So and Zeus and Dione, which is not quite right. They're saying that Aphrodite was born out of that. Now, if you remember from creation, it's Aphrodite was born from the foam of Uranus's genitals. Okay, they fall into the ocean. This foam comes up, and Aphrodite comes, sailing onto the shore. However, in the Iliad, okay, Homer's epic, the Iliad, which is about the Trojan War, or at least about a certain section of the Trojan War, towards the about 7, almost 10 years in, but not quite the end. So it's about 7 years in, I think. So the Iliad is this long 24-book epic, the most complete one we have. In that epic, at one point, there is a scene which, Aphrodite gets involved on the battlefield to try to save her son Aeneas, and she's spotted by the Greek hero Diomedes, who, he ends up grazing her, and he says something to her like, you shouldn't be on the battlefield. Your type should not be on the battlefield. And of course, you could see that as very misogynistic, but she is a goddess of love, although traditionally goddesses of love are also goddesses of war in the ancient times. Aphrodite probably was not exactly that, but so she goes back crying, and they said she runs to her mother, Dione, which is actually supposed to be sort of a female kind of a Zeus. So Dione is not a real god, I don't know. Dione, that's the only place we see Dione mentioned is in the Iliad. So that's another, I have mentioned that you might see multiple stories of these gods, their origins, where they come from, what their stories are. And here's one of those contradictory stories. But in any case, that's where this idea of Zeus plus Dione. And now Zeus's actual wife, who he's actually married to, is Hera. And they have 4 children. They have Hebe, they have Hephaestus, they have Ares, and they have Aletheia. Now, Aletheia and Hebe are not considered to be Olympians. They are important. Aletheia is a goddess of childbirth, and Hebe is the cupbearer of the gods. She's the one who serves the gods, and she's eventually married to Heracles when he's made immortal. But Hephaestus and Ares are definitely 2 Olympian gods. They're considered Olympians. So far we have the 6 at the top. We have Hephaestus, we have Ares, we have Athena, we have Hermes, we have Aphrodite. And as you'll notice, there's 2 more left. That's 13, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so Zeus and Leto. Now, Leto was also a woman who he had a tryst with or relationship with before he married Hera. But Hera still, of course, didn't like that. But and she actually has the twins, Apollo and Artemis. Okay, and well, again, we'll get into their stories. But then he mates with a human woman named Semele, at least in the traditional Greek version. The Orphic version, as I've mentioned, it's Zeus and Persephone. Persephone is actually his niece, but she's a daughter of the goddess Demeter. You know, but in this version, the more commonly known version, it's Zeus and Semele, who's a priestess. And Dionysus ends up becoming the product of that union. Now, so we've got, okay, Hestia. Okay, Hades, by the way, okay, Hades does not live on Mount Olympus. He's technically part of this Olympian group, but he lives in the underworld. Okay. However, Hestia, Poseidon, Demeter, Hera, Hestia, Poseidon, Demeter, Hera, Zeus. Okay, that's 5. Athena is 6. Hermes is 7. Aphrodite is 8. Hephaestus is 9. Ares is 10. Apollo and Artemis are 11 and 12. So where's Dionysus come in? Well, by the end of Dionysus's story, and we'll talk about him and his, you know, what his adventures are. But eventually Dionysus he's been on the earth, but he comes up to Mount Olympus. Okay. Now, really, technically, if Semele's his mother, then he's a demigod. He's not really a god. And by the way, this is, you can see where the Jesus model's coming in already. You know, it's like, oh, you know, divine father and earthly mother, you know, and the earthly mother happens to be a priestess who's supposed to be virginal and so forth. So, you know, and, but ends up being this divine being, and he goes up to Mount Olympus. But since there can only be 12, the goddess Hestia decides there's too much drama on Mount Olympus, so she's going to go back down to earth, and Dionysus can take her place on the mount. So then he becomes in a second wave of 12. All right. And here's all their names. And what I have here are the Roman equivalents, because Roman mythology, that's going to be a separate class, but there's a heavy borrowing from the Greek. And now those of you who will say, yes, but the Romans, their predecessors were the Etruscans. Yeah, and the Etruscans borrowed a lot from the Greeks. So it's not, you know, and by the way, it's not entirely true that Rome is just simply the, you know, Etruscan culture, you know, reconstituted. There's other elements there. And if you didn't know about that, you're going to learn about it. So in the meantime, but, you know, you will see the Greek and Roman names. And as you will notice, a lot of these names are also the names of our planets. Okay, so there was the assumption when you looked in the sky. Now, whether or not people literally believe they were looking at Mars or Venus or Jupiter or Saturn in the sky, you know, probably not. But nonetheless, there's, you know, based on the, you know, astrology dovetails with this, but astrology is not originally a Greek thing. It comes from the Chaldeans mainly, who are more of an Eastern, more like from Persia and those areas of Mesopotamia, that kind of Babylonian culture. Astrology comes out of there. And that is where the sky, the map of the divine ends up becoming. And again, once we get into the idea of humanism, that becomes also a map of the human soul. So, but again, separate topic. So Zeus is known as either Jupiter or Jove. Also, you will see in other places, like in Ovid or in Virgil's Aeneid. Hera is also known as Juno. Hestia is also known as Vesta. So if you ever heard Procol Harum talking about the 16 Vestal virgins, yeah, those are priestesses of Hestia or Vesta. Hermes, who's also known as Mercury. Hephaestus is also known as Vulcan. Athena is also known as Minerva. Ares is also known as Mars. Aphrodite is known as Venus. Dionysus is also known as Bacchus. Poseidon is also known as Neptune. And Apollo, he's the same in both. Artemis is also known as Diana, and Demeter is known as Ceres or Ceres, which is, by the way, where the word cereal comes from, because it has to do with grain. And the reason there's a little asterisk next to Dionysus's name is because, as I mentioned, he is really a 13th who comes in, and Hestia also has an asterisk because the two of them trade places. Okay. So let's talk about Hera first, and as the wife of Zeus. And she's queen of the gods, therefore, because Zeus is king. And we talked about Zeus and Zeus's rise to power, so I'm not going to repeat a whole lot of info about him, but we'll, see where he fits in here. Again, they're both children of Kronos, which means they're also brother and sister. And again, there's the incest theme, but you have to also remember gods are not like humans. We can't look at them and say, oh, that's gross, brothers. They're not humans, they're forces. It's best to think of them that way. They're forces that represent different things. And when those forces merge in some fashion, there's results from that. Okay. That might be the best way to think about it, that the relationship in some sense is metaphorical. Okay. Although it may be representing an actual process that goes on in the universe. Okay. So how do Zeus and Hera get together? Well, Hera refuses his advances, but then he seduces her by appearing as a little poor, wet, bedraggled bird, and she feels sorry for it, and she takes it to her breast. And then he turns into Zeus and he ravishes her, and she's so horrified by this because one of Hera's characteristics is that she's very, very proper and very traditional. So, she's somebody who's not going to engage in intercourse outside of a proper traditional marriage. Okay, which was a thing even then. And again, there's a whole host of reasons for that. But so she ends up marrying him and she becomes the queen of the gods. And as I mentioned, they had those 4 children. But her relationship with Zeus is always contentious. And in a sense, their marriage ends up becoming the prototype for a more cynical view of marriage. The husband and wife who are always nagging at each other, the husband who's always out philandering, the wife who gets really pissed off and tries to get revenge. Hera and Zeus are pretty much the archetype of this. I mean, they are absolutely. But the thing is, because of Zeus's position and his power, she can't really go after him. So she goes after the women and the children of the people he seduces. And we'll see examples of that throughout when we look at the stories. Now, her sacred animals are the cow and the peacock. And oftentimes, I remember I talked about epithets, for example, Zeus being referred to as Zeus, son of Kronos, in these epic poems that were often sung. Here, Hera is referred to she's frequently referred to as cow-eyed Hera. Okay. And it's meant in a complimentary way because she supposedly has these big, beautiful brown eyes. Okay. And frequently when you see statuary of Hera, she will have a peacock sitting next to her. So that tends to be her animal. And we talked about their children. And I like to talk about the qualities of those children because again, remember, the gods, in as much as they may have had a reality, they also tend to represent psychological qualities or forces that are experienced in the universe, not only in human interactions, but in our interactions with nature. Okay. So Hebe means youthful bloom, and she's the cupbearer to the gods. Aletheia is the childbirth goddess. There's a lot of goddesses, by the way, you're going to find because they become earlier deities, local deities become conflated with the cult of the 12. So then you're going to find there's going to be multiple people, multiple deities, even some that you don't really understand why become associated with childbirth. This happens quite a bit. But Aletheia is the sort of official midwife to the goddesses. Hephaestus is the divine artisan or craftsmith of the gods, and Ares is the god of war. So we have this idea of creation, bloom, childbirth, but we also have this idea of war, contention. And Hephaestus, I think, Hephaestus has a lot to do with war, actually. He's the one who crafts all the weapons that they use. He can also create beautiful things too, but he is the artisan. And it's important to remember that, maybe to know that the craftsmen, that those who could work with iron, those that could work with bronze, those who knew how to take metals and make them into things were considered to be magicians in their own right. So they were extremely special and powerful people in the community, but their power lies in their mastery of the technology. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Zeus and his other partners and the children they produced. Leto, they're not really entirely sure what the name means, might mean the hidden one, in Greek, was pregnant when Zeus married Hera, as I mentioned. And because Hera was extremely jealous, she decreed that Leto could not give birth on land. And then she managed to detain Aletheia so that while she was in labor, she just couldn't give birth without the childbirth goddess being there. Finally, Iris, who is the rainbow goddess and the messenger of the gods. She's one of the messengers, divine messengers. She goes and she fetches Aletheia to help Leto give birth. And she's chased by chthonic monsters, meaning monsters of the deep, monsters from under the earth, as she looks for a place to give birth. That must be fun, right? You know, here you are, you're pregnant, you're trying to give birth, and you've got all this crap going on. And finally, the island of Delos she's able to lay there and give birth. And this is why the island of Delos becomes sacred to both Artemis and Apollo, but is actually hated by Hera after that. So it's, you'll find that, when Hera doesn't get her way, she ends up hating the people and the situation that aided her opponent. Troy being a big example of this. So in any case, yes, so Zeus and Leto, they give birth to Artemis and Apollo. Zeus's liaison with Metis, again, this was one that happened before he's married to Hera. So the way that this happens is that he gets a prophecy that his second child would kill him, not succeed him. So he swallows Metis, just like Dad Kronos, doesn't learn anything, swallows Metis. And but her child is still within him, so the child ends up popping out through his forehead. Now, some people see this as somewhat misogynistic. They say, well, see, that's just showing that the man's going to give birth, and that therefore she's a superior woman because she came out of the forehead of a man, And Athena is a military strategist, but she also has a lot to do with true judgment and, like Athenian democracy and the idea of having jury trials and so forth. You'll see is very much connected with Athena as well. So she has a lot to do with justice, but she's also a craftsman herself. She can weave, and she's so she's rather a multifaceted kind of goddess. But there's a warrior bent to her. There's a bent that we tend to think of as being more masculine, and she's a virgin goddess too. We're going to talk about her. But so, and the way that she's born is that Hephaestus takes a hammer or an axe and whacks Zeus in the forehead, and it splits open, and then Athena jumps out, fully grown, by the way, not as a baby, fully grown. So, but I don't know. Athena is a rather complex character. So, okay. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. This is what we have here. Zeus and Maya. Maya is one of the Pleiades. She's one of the daughters of the Titan Atlas. Okay. I'm trying to think of their 6 or 7 Pleiades. I can't remember. It's one star cluster. And so she's a nymph, basically. She's on the earth, the nymphs tend to be associated with water. Okay, they're like water spirits. And so Zeus mates with her in a mountain cave, as she was sort of a hermit. She didn't hang around with other gods. And their child was Hermaeus, okay, who becomes the messenger of the gods, but who also was the ultimate trickster. And I mentioned here the story of Hermaeus and Apollo, and I'm going to read it to you quickly from Apollodorus's account. And the mythographer Apollodorus gives a short summary of what they call the Homeric hymn to Hermaeus. Okay, Homer, there's a number of hymns. In addition to writing Iliad and the Odyssey, there's a number of hymns to the gods that are attributed to Homer, although we don't know if Homer's actually the author. And so he describes the birth of Hermaeus and the theft of the cattle. So this is from Pseudo-Apollodorus Bibliotheca, book 3, lines 112 to 115. Okay, and this is about the 2nd century CE, Common Era. Okay, so it says Maya, after her intercourse with Zeus, bore Hermaeus in a cave on Kyllene. Though he was laid out in swaddling clothes with her winnowing basket for a cradle, he escaped and made his way to Pieria, where he stole some cattle that Apollo was tending. To keep from being discovered by the tracks, he put boots on their feet and led them to Pylos. He hid them in a grotto, except for 2 which he sacrificed, pinning up their hides on rocks, boiling some of the meat for his meal, and burning the rest. Outside the cave, he found a tortoise feeding. He cleaned it out, poor tortoise, and stretched it across the shell, made strings made from the cattle he had sacrificed, and he had thus devised a lyre that he also infected a plectrum. Meanwhile, Apollo reached Pylos in his search for the cattle, asked the locals about them. They told him they indeed seen a boy driving some cattle, but they could not say where they had been driven because there were no tracks to be found. So Apollo learned who the thief was by divine science, meaning through an oracle, made his way to Maya on Kyllene to charge Hermaeus. Maya, however, showed Apollo the baby in his swaddling clothes, whereupon Apollo took him to Zeus and demanded his cattle. When Zeus told Hermaeus to return them, he denied everything, but since his father would not believe him, he led Apollo to Pylos and gave him back his cattle. Then when Apollo heard the liar, he exchanged the cattle for that. As Hermaeus was tending the cattle, this time he fashioned a shepherd's pipe, which he proceeded to play. Covetous of this also, Apollo offered him the golden staff, which he held when he herded cattle. But Hermaeus wanted both the staff and proficiency in the art of prophecy in return for the pipe. So he was taught how to prophesy by means of pebbles and gave Apollo the pipe. And Zeus made Hermaeus his personal herald and messenger of the gods beneath the earth. Okay. And it's apparently a very funny story when you read the whole text, because, apparently Apollo's furious. He brings this kid and said, "This kid stole my cattle." And Zeus is just sitting there like trying not to laugh, because it's the most hilarious thing that this baby has like stolen something from Apollo and is like, "Not me, I'm a baby, I don't do that." But this establishes Hermaeus as sort of a trickster figure, and we'll talk a little more about him. Zeus and Semele. Okay, this is the other union. Semele was a Theban princess, the only mortal parent of a god, okay, and priestess of Zeus. And her parents were Cadmus and Harmonia, who were the founders of Thebes. And we'll talk about them in the Theban saga. But what happens is she's pregnant. She's this high-ranking, and she encounters this old Hera disguised as an old woman, and tells her that she's pregnant, but she thinks that this may be the child of Zeus. And the old woman says to her, like very skeptical, like, yeah, this guy told you he's a god. Yeah, all right. Well, you know what? This is what I want you to do. Next time you see him, you tell him if he's a god, he has to show himself to you as a god to prove that he's a god. Now, Hera, of course, knows full well what's going to happen when she does this, but she has no idea. So she sees Zeus next time, and she says, will you give me anything I ask for? He says, "Oh yes, anything you want." And so then when she says, "I want to see you as a god," he becomes very distraught. And he kind of knows there's a trickery that's gone on, because, but he's made a promise, he has to keep it. And as soon as she sees his immortal form, she burns up. That's one of the characteristics of gods as well, is that when you see a god in its actual form, your human body can't take it, and it will be reduced to ash. Okay, so she burns up on the sight, but he manages to rescue the child Dionysus and sews him up in his thigh. And then he gives birth to Dionysus from there. Okay, and but this is one example of how Hera gets back at the women who her husband has slept with. Okay. And the Zeus and Dione thing, I had mentioned that. She seems to be equivalent of Gaia or Ge, and some people saying that perhaps a female Zeus as well. In the Iliad, I have two L's in there, there's only one. She's listed as the mother of Aphrodite, and her name means, it basically means goddess, and possibly again female form of Zeus. But again, the Iliad is the only place she's mentioned as the mother of Aphrodite. Probably the more traditional story because Aphrodite means foam-born, so the Gaia and Uranus story makes a little bit more sense. Okay, so just some of Zeus's other lovers who appear. Europa, who, yes, the continent of Europe is named for. She's carried off by Zeus in the form of a white bull. She sees this beautiful white bull. She goes and pets it and decides to climb on it, and then he just takes off with her. And her child by Zeus is King Minos, and also to Rhadamanthus. And they are actually, Minos and Rhadamanthus also become judges of the underworld. Because Minos was considered to be the epitome of the wise king. Okay, he was the king of Crete, and the most famous story of him involves Theseus and the Minotaur. And I have another class where I'll talk about Theseus and his exploits, killing the Minotaur and nearly marrying Minos' daughter Ariadne, who then ends up becoming married to Dionysus. But it's Minos is, he's considered to be the epitome of the wise king, and that's why in death he becomes, and by the way, important to note that initially there was no such thing as judgment in the underworld. It had nothing, your going to the underworld had nothing to do with how you were as a human being or what you did. Everybody just went there. And later on, after we get into Greek philosophy and thought, then we start to see the myths kind of altering to where we have this idea of judges. And that is definitely a much later development, closer to the time of the Roman Empire, really, is when you start seeing this idea of judges in the underworld. Okay. So, but Rhadamanthus is another one. And if you've ever read Dante's Inferno, you'll know that as Virgil and Dante are moving their way through the underworld, they see King Minos, who's more like a demon in that, passing judgment on souls in hell. So that ends up that classical carryover that ends up happening. But Minos is not considered to be any kind of an evil being. He's just considered to be a very, very wise king in this version. Io, another priestess of Hera, of God of all things. See how he could have done that to her. But after he seduced her, he turns her into a cow, and then he tries to hide her away. So the Hera doesn't see it, like, no, but then so she's in the form of a cow, and Hera is very suspicious. So she sends another being with like hundreds of eyes. Maybe that's where the peacock idea comes in, to watch her, and in watching, so that to see whether or not she changes back into Io. But then this ends up driving her mad. So, and that's another thing Hera is good at doing, is creating madness. She creates the madness in Dionysus as well. And Danae, in the famous myth of Perseus and Medusa. Okay, she's the daughter of King Acrisius, and king of Argos, which is one of the Greek kingdoms. And so Zeus appears to her as a glittering shower of gold. Her father has locked her away in a tower somewhere, so that she can't, no man can have her. And that's another theme that I want to talk about in the incest thing. Even though her father's not committing incest with her, what incest tends to represent falls into the category of the father who locks the daughter away. Okay, it's a similar, both psychological and biological, creates the same kind of crisis. So Danae is mother of Perseus, and so they get away to an island, and then there's a whole story that goes along with that we'll talk about in the Sea Deities lecture when we talk about Medusa. But so these are the main stories of the women seduced by Zeus. Probably not the only ones, but these are the main ones we know of. Sorry, there are a couple more that I mentioned here. Callisto, yeah, I think about that one when I look at the sky and I see the Big Dipper and Little Dipper in the sky. She's a priestess of Artemis, another one that Zeus should have left alone, because Artemis is a virgin goddess and she is chaste. And she's taken a vow of chastity to Artemis, but what happens is that Zeus takes the form of Artemis, and Artemis calls to her, so she runs to her mistress, and then the mistress turns into Zeus and rapes her, basically. And the son she has is Arcas. And to punish her, of course Zeus never gets punished. To punish her, Artemis turns her into a bear. And her son Arcas, as he grows up, he's out hunting, and the bear sees him, and she knows it's her son, and she tries to call out to him, but instead he's going to kill her. And Zeus takes pity on them and turns Arcas also into a bear and puts them both in the sky. And so they're Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, Big Bear and Little Bear, Big Dipper, Little Dipper. So they become constellations. And Ganymede. Ganymede is our one, well, it's not the only one, but it's one of the main homosexual stories that we see in Greek mythology. And yeah, it was a beautiful Trojan prince. He was the son of Tros, who was the sort of progenitor of the line of Troy, and which is also called Ilium. And so Ganymede is, he has his sons. He has another son called Ilium, and then he has his son Ganymede. And Zeus thinks Ganymede's so beautiful that he takes the form of an eagle and swoops up Ganymede and carries him off to Mount Olympus in this whirlwind. And which was, by the way, why at least one of the reasons it's almost never talked about as to why Hera hates Troy so much, because this son of Tros, became the sexual partner of her husband. And but Ganymede was kept on Mount Olympus, and along with Hebe, they're both cupbearers to the gods. So Ganymede stays there. And the constellation and zodiac sign of Aquarius is based on Ganymede, because Ganymede is the cupbearer. So he's, so that's why the Aquarius is called the water bearer. He's the one that provides the cup. So that's where that comes from. Okay, so now we're going to talk about each 12 of the 12 Olympians individually. Okay. First, we have Poseidon. Poseidon's the god of the sea and of earthquakes. Okay, and he's very quarrelsome by nature. It's almost like he's considered to be a version of Zeus that is, you know, kind of like the what you call it? He's Poseidon is the it's like he's almost like he's the emotional side of Zeus, if that makes any sense. Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon divided up the universe between them. Zeus taking the heavens, Poseidon taking the sea, and Hades taking the underworld, and those were their domains and kingdoms. And yeah, he tends to be sort of very bad-tempered and very capricious. And when you think about the way that water is, if you're a sailor, it can be very, very calm, and a big storm can come up the next minute. Not hard to see why those qualities are associated with Poseidon. His wife is Amphitrite, who he met, who liked the Zeus-Hera marriage. She was initially rejected by him, but Dolphinus, the dolphin, actually went to Amphitrite and negotiated so that she would marry Poseidon. So then the dolphin was given very special status in the sea. Okay, and some people say that, you know, that's why the dolphin's so much more intelligent and so forth. I mean, yeah, it's metaphorical, it's mythological, but it's but you know, the reason the dolphin had such special status was because you know, Poseidon wanted to marry Amphitrite, and you know, and the dolphin helped him get what he wanted. Yeah, and then there's the challenge of Athens. When Athens became this powerful city-state, there was a disagreement over who the patron deity was going to be, and so there was a contest between Athena and Poseidon, because they both wanted to claim Athens. And Athens obviously is named after Athena, as you can see, because she wins this contest. They both they have to offer something to the king, and whatever's considered to be the most useful is the one. So Poseidon sticks his trident in the ground, and a spring comes up, spring of fresh water comes up. But Athena does her magic, and she produces the olive tree. And they judge that to be more useful because the olive tree, not only can the wood be used, the fragrant wood, but also it produces the olives, and you know, so it can provide food, and the wood can also provide other things. So it's judged slightly more useful. And so this, of course, made Poseidon angry, but they still built a big temple to him on the water, you know, to appease him, to say, well, you know, it's like the beauty contest. You're the first runner-up, you know, congratulations, you still get a crown and a prize. So, so, you know, but nonetheless, there's, you know, it made for a little contention. Aphrodite, okay, Aphrodite is the goddess of love and beauty. We are going to talk about her more at length in the love mythology section. And as I mentioned, we've already talked about her being born of either Zeus and Dione, or of from Oranos in that initial trauma. And again, she is the goddess of love. She's the goddess of desire, considered to be the most beautiful of the gods. And all the gods, they hate her in some way, because they can't seem to escape her influence. Like, she's always making the gods do stupid things, like by falling in love with humans and doing different things. And she's, but Zeus ends up marrying her to Hephaestus, who's the ugliest of the gods. And of course, that marriage is never consummated. She's sleeping around with everybody else, including most notably the war god Ares. Okay, and Ares and Venus, or Ares and Aphrodite, I should say, because we're sticking to the Greek, produced Harmonia, which is interesting. They got, you know, harmony, and she ends up being married to the founder of Thebes, Cadmus. So it's yeah. You know, and so Hephaestus is, you know, he's, you know, poor Hephaestus, he has this wife, and he can never, you know, I imagine the psychology of that. You know, it's just like, yeah, you have this wife, she's the wife who's continually philandering on the husband. And Zeus in particular, since he seems to not be able to control himself, particularly has a thing against Aphrodite. So he gets his revenge by making her fall in love with a mortal man, a shepherd called Anchises. And she appears to Anchises as a kind of princess. And they make love, and their son is Aeneas, who is the hero of the Aeneid, and he's also mentioned in the Trojan War narratives. And he's also kind of the you know, he's sort of that's sort of the patron genealogical story of Rome, comes from Aeneas. So But Anchises, when Aphrodite and Anchises mate, when he realizes that the woman he was with was the goddess of love, she basically tells him, look, you can't tell anybody about this. You can't tell anybody. But men can't, it seems like in a lot of these stories, not just in Greek myth, but you see it in Celtic myth and other places, they just can't help themselves. They have to brag. So he does. And of course, Zeus punishes him by blinding him, takes a lightning bolt and blinds him. And however, afterwards, Anchises has the gift of prophecy, which you will see is a condition of blindness. When you talk about blind Tiresias is another one. Well, these different figures in Greek drama, in Greek myth, who are blind, also have the gift of prophecy because they don't have external sight, but they have internal sight. Demeter, she's the goddess of the fields and of agriculture. So she is very much an earth mother. We see these various earth mothers. The most famous story associated with her and associated with her mystery cult was her daughter Persephone, who's also known as Kore, which means young girl, is taken away by Hades. And so we have that myth that, at least on the surface, is the myth of winter and spring, but it also has to do with death and resurrection. The Demeter story and the cycle I'm going to talk about in the underworld mythology class, so I'm not going to get into the story here, but the basic executive summary is that Demeter, Persephone at this point is determined to stay a virgin to Artemis. Another theme, these are girls dedicated to Artemis, and then, something happens. And Aphrodite has her son Eros shoot his arrows of love into the underworld, and Hades sees Persephone and is smitten and has to have her as his wife. So he drives his chariot out of the underworld up into the fields and just carries her right off, with the blessing of Zeus, by the way, who's her uncle. And of course, Demeter doesn't know what's happened to her. And so she goes on this long search. And eventually it's the goddess Hecate, who lights the torches in the underworld. She's a very honored deity, but she's an underworld deity associated with magic, witchcraft, and the darker phases of the moon. Hecate finds out and tells Demeter what's happened. So Demeter gets mad and says, well, that's it. I'm not, then she just turns the entire world barren because she's mad. And Zeus is trying to appeal to her. And she says, no, you took my daughter away from me. So finally, he has to reach a deal with Hades where she can spend part of the year with her mother and part of the year in the underworld. And initially, it's going to be she's just going to go back to her mother. But then Persephone eats the food of the underworld, the pomegranate seed. And so now she can't leave, because Hades is like, oh, yeah, okay, sure, and then they find out that she's done this. So then it becomes a deal like, okay, we're just going to spend part of the year in the underworld and part of the year with her mother. So when she spends time with her mother, that's when you have spring and summer. When she returns to the underworld, that's when you start to have fall and winter. Okay, that's the surface, but there's more to it, as we'll see. Hephaestus, okay, craftsmith of the gods. He's often portrayed as crippled. One interesting story I heard about that, and I'm sure I read it in Jake Stratton Kent, although I can't quite remember where it was in his book Gia Sophia, because it's a 2-volume, and I've looked for it. I've even asked him where it is. And I don't think for the answer I got from him that he quite remembered, but it was, he's part of the reason that he might be portrayed as crippled. The story that they give is that Hera is so disgusted by him, she throws him out of heaven, and when he lands on the earth, he breaks his leg. But there's also the idea that, as I mentioned, craftsmiths, because those who could, were magicians that could work with the technology, were so important to a tribe that they couldn't have them running off and helping the enemy. So they would lame them. They would be crippled so that they couldn't leave their shop. They wouldn't be able to run away. So that is another potential interpretation here that's been seen. He's married to Aphrodite. But what eventually reconciles him to Hera, it's funny, he gets picked up on an island by a couple that take pity on him, and he starts crafting these beautiful things, and he ends up making these gorgeous necklaces and things, and Hera sees them from where she is. She goes, who's making those? And then she finds out it's the son she threw out. So at that point, she reconciles and says, okay, he can come back on Mount Olympus, which says something about Hera's character too. But I have a whole podcast on that, actually, on Hera and on her way. She's actually, she's the queen of the gods. She's very proper. She's very traditional, and sometimes she can be just very callous and very evil. So it's you can't unilaterally name any of these gods good or evil. They just do what they do. Okay. Hermaeus, he's a messenger of the gods and the son of Zeus and Maya. And we mentioned the story I read to you of how he stole Apollo's cattle. And so we see immediately his trickster nature. And he carries the caduceus, which is a symbol, actually it's a symbol of commerce. And I think the reason he's associated with commerce, if you see in that initial thing with Apollo, he's bartering. He's like, okay, I have this thing and I'm going to trade with you. I'm going to have some of your cattle and you're going to take my instruments and you're going to, so there's this trading that goes on. So he ends up becoming associated with business and commerce. And I mentioned here, it's not to, that is not to be confused with the staff of Asclepius, which is used as the symbol of medicine. Asclepius is a healing god, a healer god. In fact, he's so good at healing that Zeus actually kills him and puts him in the underworld because otherwise mortals will end up living forever, which they don't want. So Hermaeus ends up being associated with that. He is also what is known as a psychopomp, and we'll talk about that in the underworld class, but he is the one who leads souls into the underworld, souls of the dead, through the fields of asphodel to the underworld. So he is definitely what I call liminal figure. He's on the edge between, and he travels between the earth, the underworld, and Mount Olympus. And he does serve as the messenger. You'll see him in many epics appearing to tell different heroes like, hey, get off your duff and go do this. You're going down this path. The gods don't want you to do that. They want you to do this instead. He's very much about that. Okay, so that's the end of this particular presentation. So now I'm going to let me open up and start the other one. I'm going to take that down. I got to open up my next one and share screen. Here we go. Okay, and then play. Okay, so this is part 2. We'll go through this quickly. All right, so now we're moving on to Athena. Athena is a goddess of wisdom, women's arts, and war. Okay, she's so again, she deals with very, very practical, domestic kind of crafts. But as a goddess of wisdom, this is why she tends to be associated with justice, with rationality. Okay, coming out of the forehead of Zeus, but she's also a goddess of war, but war with strategy. She's not a goddess who is she's a strategist. She's not somebody who is, let me find the right words here. She's not like Ares. Ares is a god of war, but he's a god of brute force. Athena is about thinking it out, about strategy, even about diplomacy, because sometimes diplomacy is better than war, right? But she's usually known for her mercy and equitable judgment, though occasionally you will see her in some of the Greek dramas. I think particularly the story of Ajax, where you see her making him hallucinate and murder all of these animals because he thinks they're the Greek soldiers. He's mad because he's lost this contest and he thinks he should have won against Odysseus. So he imagines himself murdering all the great Trojan generals, Agamemnon, Odysseus, the different ones. And then they find him doing this. And when they realize what he thinks he's doing, and Athena calls Odysseus over and goes, hey, check this out. And she seems like she's really cruel when she does that, but she's actually saving the Greek soldiers. And she's getting Ajax back because when on the battlefield, when she came to aid him, he said, go away, woman, go to the others. I don't need your help. And the one thing warriors have to learn is you always need the help of the feminine. You always need that war goddess to help you. In Celtic stories of the Morrigan, you'll see this a lot. Cuchulainn rejecting, the Morrigan when she says, hey, come with me and I'll make sure you have victory tomorrow. And he says, yeah, get away, woman. And so, and then not only does he lose, like he gets his, he ends up having to hold himself up with his own intestines. He's, as he's dying, she gets him back. It's, that's a whole, metaphor, there's a whole theme back there about the nature of war. We tend to think of war as something very masculine. War actually has a very strongly feminine component to it. So, but not to, that's a theme we'll develop in other classes. But she's credited with inventing many technologies. She is a virgin. She's an avowed virgin. Literally, the only story of her with a child is King Eryctheonis of Athens, the first king. Supposedly is born Hephaestus desires Athena and tries to ravish her. But when he ejaculates, it lands on her foot. Like she pushes him off, but it lands on her foot. And so she shakes the sperm off of her foot, and Eryctheonis sprouts out of that. So, but she does take care of him, even though this wasn't, this was actually a failed attempt. This child is still born. It's a very, very weird story, but that's literally the only story associating Athena with a child. The famous story of her is that of her and Arachne. Arachne is a woman who is a very, very talented weaver. But she dares to boast that her weaving is better than that of Athena's. She's even better than Athena. Athena couldn't beat me. So Athena, of course, appears as an old woman and tells her, you should never say things like that. And she says, go away, old woman. Why doesn't she just come here and challenge me herself? So the old woman turns into Athena and says, you're on. Now, the thing about this contest, they're both weaving a tapestry. And Arachne is actually, she's defiant right to the end. She's weaving an account of all the things that have humiliated the gods. And Athena is outraged. And technically, Arachne actually wins the competition. But Athena punishes her by turning her into a spider. So spiders, the elaborate webs they weave, they're arachnids. That's where that comes from. That comes from that story of Athena. But that the moral of that story, if there is one, has to do with the idea of hubris, hubris. Hubris is like the they didn't really use the word sin. Sin was not a concept in ancient Greece, but it was the idea of you could think of it that way. It was that the human error of pride, of thinking you're better than the divine. Like that's the worst thing that you could do, because you're pretty much toast if you think you're better than the divine. And there are many accounts of that. But the stories aren't meant to be moral. They're just meant to demonstrate to you the power of these forces, and you as a human being are not greater than these forces. Okay, so, okay, Ares, yeah, he's a god of war. And the stories about him, I mean, again, the war stories, obviously, you'll see Ares marching on the battlefield. He doesn't have much of a personality. There is a scene in the Iliad where after he fights with Athena, as I mentioned here, that he's a more skilled fighter. She's a more skilled fighter than he is. The two of them fight it out, and Athena bests him. And he goes back to Zeus and complains, why don't you control that daughter of yours? And Zeus turns around on him and says, get out of my sight. I hate you, and I would actually throw you into the depths of Tartarus if you weren't my own son. Like, Zeus hates him because of what he represents, of the chaos and destruction that he represents. Because remember that Zeus is there, even though he fought a hard battle, he's there to establish order. He does not like Ares. So the only immortals that like him are Eris, who is the goddess of strife, and Aphrodite, who seems to be enamored by him and by his, his powerful way. And maybe that's a commentary on the way that very sensual women might go for very powerful, or very physically powerful men, or at least that's the conception. But Ares is, he's very much disliked by and all of the gods, and like I said, his own father hates him, but he's there, and he's a fact of how human life is. Okay, and we'll talk about Hestia here, or Vesta. She's the goddess of the hearth and home. Okay, and so people always kept fires burning to Hestia on the hearth. You did not want those fires, and the sacred fires, you did not want to go out. It was a very bad omen. So she kind of keeps to herself. She's the ultimate sort of domestic goddess. She stays away. She's not interested in the disputes of the gods. She doesn't have an opinion. She doesn't take a side. Perhaps in the way a proper wife was supposed to be, as opposed to Hera, but she's not anybody's wife. She's also a virgin. There is the one story of her attempted rape by Priapus. Now, so you should go into Google and look up in Google Images and look up Priapus. It's pretty hilarious. He is this like nature kind of spirit with a schlong that is like this big, and he is portrayed that way in ancient frescoes and everything else. He is highly fertile, highly horny kind of a god, and so he tries to sneak up on Hestia when she's sleeping. But then a donkey that's nearby brays really loudly and wakes her up and scares Priapus, and she screams and runs away. So after that, the donkey became sacred to Hestia, but not to Priapus, because the donkey, ruined his thing. And as I've mentioned, eventually she, when Dionysus comes up to Mount Olympus and there can't be 13, there has to be 12, she gives up her place. Okay. Artemis or Diana, okay, she's the goddess of the hunt and the goddess of the moon. She's Apollo's twin sister. And again, a virgin goddess, and virginity, I mean, is required. If her followers do not do that, she will cut them down. And Artemis plays a very interesting role in adolescent girls. There's a lot of rituals to Artemis. Artemis Broron, for instance, where girls walk around acting like bears. Okay, there's like this way that as one moves into womanhood, that Artemis doesn't kill them for giving up their virginity. It's an interesting thing. It's a huge topic. Sarah Iles Johnston talks a lot about it in her book, The Restless Dead, which is about ancient Greek underworld ghosts and things like that. And she also, and I have a podcast on it called The Hanging Virgins, where I talk a lot about this, and the one on the Aori, which is where the Artemis mythology comes from. You know, where we talk more in depth about that particular role of Artemis. So she is a patroness of childbirth, which is interesting, which means she's probably subsumed an earlier childbirth goddess into her characteristics. Okay, you know, so she's talking about virginity, but also childbirth, right? Although if you see this as her role in transitioning people from girls to being women, it makes sense. But also I should mention that Artemis and her brother Apollo are both also gods of violent death, especially among children. And there's a story of Niobe that demonstrates that. Niobe is a princess on the island of Delos, where they're both born, and of course their mother Leto is a big festival for her. She's honored as the goddess and as the mother of these gods. And Niobe, very arrogant, hubris-filled queen, says, "Oh well, I have 7 sons and 7 daughters, and you know she's only had 2. You know, how is she better than me?" And of course, Leto hears this and asks her children to address this insult. So Artemis and Apollo slaughters her sons, Artemis slaughters all of her daughters, and they turn her into stone. So yeah, not a good idea to tamper with them. But they are frequently associated with violent death in children as well. Apollo, he's the god of sun. Her brother, the truth, prophecy, definitely prophecy. The oracle at Apollo at Delphi is one of the but you know, it's not the only oracle in the ancient world, but it's one of the most renowned ones. And music, poetry, healing, and the plagues. You'll notice at the beginning of a lot of stories, the stories of Oedipus, even in the Iliad, there's plagues that are sent, and they're only sent by Apollo. Okay, and so Apollo has to be placated before the plague will end. So he becomes a patron of the oracle at Delphi. There's a long story about that that has to do with the founding of Thebes. There's a python, a serpent there that Apollo ends up slaying when he goes to that spot. And this python was sacred to Ares, the god of war. So he ends up having to make reparations for that, for killing the python. But he ends up establishing his oracle there. And his priestess there is known as the Pythia from Python. Like there's these myths that rise supposedly from the underworld or from this pit, and that she's able to prophesize from that. Some people have thought, oh, it's some kind of gases that cause her to hallucinate, but they said actually going to the physical site that there's no evidence that that was ever the case. So it's interesting. Now you might think Apollo as, you know, this sun civilized guy that, you know, he's this great, almost good kind of a god. However, Apollo is not a nice guy. I remember growing up in the 80s and a lot of those 80s like movies where you had the high school football player who was also the big bully who pushed all the weaker kids around. That's Apollo. That's Apollo. There was a musical contest I mentioned here between Marsyas and he has musical contests with 2 satyrs. Satyrs are like half goat, half human type figures. They're nature spirits. And he has musical contests with them because they both believe that in playing their little pipes that they actually can play better than Apollo on his lyre. So he challenges them. He beats both of them, but with Marsyas, to punish him for challenging him, he actually has him flayed alive and his skin hung up. You know, he's a sore winner. You know, that's quite a thing if you're going to lose. And the story of Apollo and Daphne, I like to tell this one because what happens with Apollo is now that's just the thing too. You would think for this handsome deity, he'd be lucky in love, but he's not. He has a terrible time with love. And particularly there's several different encounters that he has with different women. But the story of Apollo and Daphne in particular She is a nymph, and again, dedicated to Artemis, making her virginal. And Apollo comes to her and tries to ravish her, and she runs away from him. But he continues to pursue her. And finally, she cries out to be saved, and she ends up being turned into a laurel tree. But when he sees the laurel tree, that she's become the tree, he starts fondling the tree. It's kind of creepy, actually. And he takes the leaves off of it and he makes a crown for himself. Okay, so it's like he's still going to get this woman, even though she's been rescued from him. And incidentally, you'll find this still in Italy and different places, that when somebody, and we also have the term in the US, the laureate, for example, the poet laureate of the United States, right? A laureate being when you get your degree, you're getting a baccalaureate, okay, from laurel. It's the idea that the laurels represent honors or achievements, since Apollo is associated with all of these kinds of achievements in the arts and civilization and so forth. So the idea is that you are a laureate, meaning you receive the crown of laurels. But that's the origin of the story, which makes getting a crown of laurels a little bit creepier than you might have imagined. So anyway, that's the story. He also falls in love with Cassandra, who is a princess of Troy. But then he gives her the gift of prophecy. But then when Cassandra eventually refuses to get involved with him, he gets angry and he says, okay, fine, you can keep the gift, but nobody will ever believe you. And when we talk about the Trojan War, you'll understand why that's a problem. Because Cassandra sees everything coming. She sees the Greeks destroying Troy, and nobody listens to her. And then they're completely destroyed after that. And she's taken as a hostage by one of the, to be the concubine of one of the Greek soldiers. So it's not, So Apollo, maybe this handsome, talented, accomplished, but not really lucky in love, and kind of a jerk at times. So, so you see, again, there's the complexity of the gods. It's not like they're good or they're bad. They have these qualities. Dionysus, okay, so yeah, he's the one who comes up as the kind of 13th. He's the god of wine, and he's associated with madness and with foreignness. That's kind of his connection to Jesus in a way, in the sense that Jesus comes and he has to convince, it's not that he's trying to convince, but nobody ever believes the divinity of this person. So in Dionysus' case, people get turned into all kinds of things. They get, he's supposedly driven to madness by Hera, and he's eventually goes to the goddess Cybele, who's the ancient Phoenician goddess, mother goddess, to be cured of his madness. But he has to establish his divinity throughout the world and convince people of it. If you ever read the Bacchae by Euripides, the Bacchae is where his own brother Pentheus refuses to accept his divinity, and because Pentheus is another son of Semele. And but what ends up happening is he ends up they try to put Dionysus in jail. He's a god, they can't keep him in jail. So Pentheus is convinced by Dionysus in another form to come witness the Dionysus festivals, where they have the orgies and the drinking and everything, and that's why these kings and things didn't want them. They were uncivilized, and like the priests of Dionysus were always from the lower classes. It was something that was a threat to the upper classes and to the aristocracy. So Dionysus, he gets convinced to dress up as a woman and go view this, and then he's spotted by his mother, who is in the completely in the rage of at the moment. His followers are often called maenads. They're wild and they're crazy, and they tear animals to bits, and they tear people to bits. They do all these crazy things. And she sees him and she ends up tearing him to bits, because he hallucinates that he's a lion and that she's killed him. And as it turns out, she's torn her own son apart. So that was his punishment from Dionysus for not accepting his divinity and trying to stop what Dionysus represents. Again, Dionysus is a complex character. There's a lot I could say, but I'm going to save it for another thing. But that's just sort of who he is. And as I've mentioned, in the creation mythology, in the Orphic system, he's considered to be the successor to Zeus. So very interesting. All right, so quick note on the cult of the 12. The idea of the cult of the 12 does not originate in Greece. Originally, Walter Burkert, the Greek religion scholar, says probably originated in Anatolia, which is an area that's now in Turkey. There were 12 Hittite male gods. There were no distinguishing features, no narrative. They were just the 12. Supposedly in Greece, they were established by Heracles, which may refer more to local beliefs and practices, but eventually the Greek tribes were united under this idea of these 12. And as I mentioned here, the 12 Olympians and cult of 12 are not necessarily the same thing, but the 12 does have a significance. And we see there's 12 Olympian deities, there's 12 labors of Heracles, there's 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 months of the year, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles of Jesus, 12 ruling imams following Muhammad. You can see the correspondences. These are some of the astrological ones that we see with these different, with the astrological, with the 12, and then with the, with the planetary, with the apostles. People make all kinds of correspondences here. But the number itself is important. And I point out what Jung says here. He says, number helps more than anything to bring order into the chaos of appearance. It is the predestined instrument for creating order or for apprehending an already existing but unknown regular arrangement or orderedness. It is not such an audacious conclusion, after all, if we define numbers psychologically as an archetype of order which has become conscious. Yeah, and one that we cling to heavily in this day and age. We think numbers define everything, or that they represent some kind of a truth, but they're really just a symbol of something else. In this case, the number 12 has a lot to do with the daytime, with the sun, okay? And this is where we eventually get into the idea of sun worship, and then son of God, and sun, the importance of the 12. The lunar year has 13 months. The solar year has 12 months. Okay. And day as opposed to night is considered to be, that's what's illuminating. That's what's civilizing. That's where the order comes from. What's scary at night doesn't look so scary in the day, right? So the idea of deus, which is the word that we end up using for God, the Latin word, and there's a Greek word that's similar as dies or day. As opposed to theos, which I mentioned has to do with the direct experience of the God. So yeah, this 12ness, Egyptians and Babylonians had 12 major gods, and Ra is the sun god of Egypt. Shamash is the sun god of the Babylonians. I mean, they're very much, they have a very central importance because they recognize how the light of the sun brings heat, allows them to grow food, allows them to do all of these things. I mean, obviously it's not the only element, but without the sun as it is, we couldn't have life as we know it. So, so we are seeing here this association, but primarily when we talk about the 12, we're talking about something solar having to do with the sun and with daytime. And that the divine ends up being associated with that light of the sun. That gets developed even further as we get closer to the Roman Empire. You'll see what they call the Neoplatonic or the Middle Platonic thinking, places the sun as some kind of a major single deity, where the moon becomes the entrance to the underworld. And, there's this whole construct that they have that I think I talk about in my podcasts on Hecate. But there's this whole construct that they get, and the whole underworld and everything gets put in the sky. The sky becomes the all important thing, probably why astrology became important too. So that's it for this one. It's been a long one. So thanks for listening. Let me stop my screen share here. And so I think that's plenty. We'll talk more in the next class. See you later.